Well, let me open by telling you that I turned 21 in the year 1969. I report this not to either brag or complain about how old I am, but to make the point that I came of age in the 1960s. That decade yielded the greatest successes of the civil rights movement. The 1960s saw the United States declare war on poverty. That decade also saw the U.S. drawn deeply into the Vietnam War, while an anti-war movement divided the nation on the home front. The 1960s gave rise to a feminist movement. The decade gave rise to a so-called counterculture that appeared to worship a trinity of sex and drugs and rock and roll, but also yielded new interest in Eastern philosophies, macrobiotic diets, communal living, and the like. With all these swirling social, political, and cultural movements going on around me, I formed the opinion that the 1960s had to have been the most exciting time to be alive ever. Fast forward to late in the year 2013. In anticipation of the 100th anniversary of cityhood, which Attleboro has been celebrating this year, Mike Kirby, the editor of the Sun-Chronicle newspaper, asked me if I would research the question of how the old town of Attleboro became the new city of Attleboro. I took the assignment gleefully, thinking that after spending 40 years as an editor and reporter with the Sun-Chronicle, I already knew this story. But I set off on a rather long research project in which the first thing I learned was that the way I knew the story was pretty much all wrong. This also shook to its roots my opinion that the 1960s were the most exciting time to live through. They were certainly rivaled by the excitement of the 19-teens. In Attleboro, a focal point of this excitement is a drive to convert the town to a city form of government. While I can't say exactly where the epicenter of this excitement was, I am absolutely sure that you are sitting somewhere close to it. By way of explaining that, let me take you back exactly 100 years to November 20th, 1914. At that time, this building is known as the Attleboro Refinery. It's a key component of the local jewelry industry, which has been booming and has spurred a 40% surge in Attleboro's population from 1900 to 1910, underpinning the campaign for a more streamlined form of government. Arguments for and against the city charter have been aired out by town meeting, which meets only a few hundred feet from here in Armory Hall, now the Attleboro Recreation Center, and which was the subject of a talk given fairly recently to the Preservation Society by Dennis Walsh, the Attleboro Recreation Director. Town Hall is in rented quarters above a bank on Park Street at Railroad Avenue. That's a fairly long 1.5 block walk from here. That's also where charter questions went to die. 3 pro-cityhood articles were passed by town meeting in 1912 and 1913 and given support in a December 1913 referendum. The Board of Selectmen chose to do nothing with any of these votes. But by November, this cycle has been broken. 2 weeks ago, that's in our imaginations, in real time, 100 years and 2 weeks ago. On the first Tuesday in November in 1914, local voters faced a yes or no referendum on whether to adopt a city charter, which by then had been approved by the legislature and governor. The election draws the second largest turnout ever in the history of Attleboro voting. Far and away the largest number of votes are cast at the Union Street voting booth. I don't know exactly where it was, but it had to be quite near here. I think really it was over by where Flowers by the station is now, but I'm not sure that it could have been where the parking lot is. This block changed a lot in the centuries. But the cityhood question passes handily. Up until now, campaigns for mayor and city council have been put on hold, officially anyway, pending the charter vote. But now that the referendum is passed, the campaigns are in full swing. People walking to, from, or near this building 100 years ago tonight almost certainly encountered a street corner rally for mayoral candidate Harold Sweet or James Leadham, or for one of the 30 candidates for city council. They doubtless also heard the noise of political rallies going on in one or another of the many social halls in the downtown area. Town Hall is busy too. New voting district lines have to be drawn because the town's 3 precincts are being replaced by 5 wards in the first city election, which will be held just a couple weeks from now on the first Tuesday in December. Steps are being taken at Town Hall too to reorganize to the new type of city administration. I'll stop trying to build suspense here. We or most of us know how that first city election turned out. Harold Sweet was elected first mayor and the city council was chosen. Most to be savored from that election, though, is the turnout. It is 96%. That's as close to a perfect voting score as you're ever going to get. I suspect that the 4% who didn't vote really were sick or out of town. So how did this happen? My nominee for hero of Attleboro's movement to cityhood would be State Rep George Worrell. Others could be Frank Mossberg, the famed inventor who was the president of the Attleboro Board of Trade and the city charter's most compelling and enthusiastic cheerleader. Or Charles Kane, editor of the Attleboro Sun, who argued cogently and persistently for a charter. Or Harold E. Sweet, whose candidacy for mayor made the idea of having a strong chief executive palatable to community leaders who were highly, highly skeptical of putting that much power into one man's hands. I think also Sweet was so attractive because he could win. He was, it was a Republican-dominated town, but Sweet happened to be a Democrat. He ran a factory, but the factory had kind of enlightened policies. They had profit sharing even back in 1914. Sweet was a guy who kind of bridged the divide between workers and administration, and he was trusted all around. But it is George Worrell who had filed a city charter bill at the State House in January 1914. And this took the question of cityhood out of the local arena. It takes it out of Town Hall, where selectmen have pretty much safely been ignoring it. 6 months after he files the bill, by June 17th of that year, the hearings have been completed, the votes have been taken, and Governor David Walsh signs the bill. I think that they'd been struggling over the charter for at least 2 years. There was some evidence that charter drives went back maybe even to 1906. Gets the State House. I don't think we'd believe it happened today. 6 months, it's done. The bill that Walsh signs calls for the referendum to be held in November. Voters, as I mentioned earlier, come out and they pass it by a healthy margin. And then they elect their first mayor and council in December. And on Inauguration Day in January 1915, city government goes to work in Attleboro, replacing town government. The funny thing, though, in all my readings about the march to cityhood in Attleboro, I never saw anybody argue that the town form of government couldn't get the job done satisfactorily. Indeed, when Frank Mossberg pointed out that the town now had good schools, a park, a library, a hospital, and such, he was saying that these advances should be capped with the crown of cityhood. But you could take the same evidence and make an argument that town meeting had been very productive. In the decade and a half or so leading up to cityhood, town meeting had coped with Attleboro's phenomenal population growth by authorizing the construction of Bliss, Richardson, Tiffany, Finburg, Lincoln, and Washington schools, as well as of a new Attleboro High School. Over on County Street, it was new then. The sewer and water systems had been expanded. The town had retired most of its debt, most of its share of the costs of elevating the railroad tracks and building the arches downtown. The authorizations needed to create Sturdy Memorial Hospital in 1913 had been passed. The gift of land for Capron Park had been accepted and the park department had been started. Appropriations had been passed to fund the new and greatly expanded Attleboro Public Library. The last years of township may have been the most productive time in Attleboro's municipal history. Along my opinion about the 60s being exciting, I stood in wonder of what Attleboro achieved during the Robbins administration at the end of the last century. I mean, you know, in her 12 years, they renovated and expanded all of the elementary and middle schools, built the water plant. But it seems to me that those last years of the town actually did a bit more than that. So why were many community leaders eager to change to city government? If I had the time to research clippings from 1894, 1896, 1903, and whenever else, I think it would bear out my hunch that most of all, if not all, the votes to build new schools and such were what sports fans might call ugly wins. Not having such time, I can still tell you that I found hints that the campaign to build the new high school had left a lot of bitterness in its wake, and that by 1914, town meeting had a tendency to take bizarre turns. Yeah.
Could you pull the podium closer? People in the last three rows can't hear you.
Oh, sure.
Just a little bit closer.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, hi, Ray. My hunch is that these votes to build a new school were all ugly wins. I found evidence in 1914 that there was bitterness still hanging from the campaign to build the new high school. And town meeting had this tendency to take bizarre turns, as when a citizen decided that the question of whether to buy the police department its first motorized vehicle was reason to deliver a temperance lecture. Town meeting worked for sure, but it looked like a carnival at times, and it tested everybody's patience. Aside from that, the move toward cityhood, I believe, was a creature of its times. Think about this. At the same time the cityhood movement is advancing, women of the community and some high-minded men are doing things locally to advance the cause of women's suffrage. In Attleboro in 1914, the only office women are allowed to vote for is school committee, but that's in the process of changing. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, which is set upon wiping out the social ills caused by demon rum, has an active local chapter and a record of success on ballot and town meeting questions designed to keep Attleboro dry. if you wanted to drink 100 years ago, you were out of luck. The only legal, in the fall of 1914, the only legal way to buy alcohol was with a prescription from your doctor. There were plenty of illegal ways, though. Residents are carefully watching the news of the Mexican Revolution and the saber rattling and raids along the U.S.-Mexico border. They're wondering if that means that Company 1, the local National Guard detachment, will be called up. They're also watching the buildup in Europe toward the Great War. Though in 1914, most of them are surely convinced that the United States will toe its isolationist line and have no part of that European war. And a lot of thought is being given locally to charitable works through which Attleboro might be able to assist its less fortunate citizens. I draw that assumption mainly from First Mayor Harold Sweet's call in his first inaugural address for formation of a municipal charitable bureau, but also from a belief that local residents are sharing the new interest in prevention of cruelty to children and to animals, in child labor laws, and public welfare. The year 1914 was a peak year of the progressive movement in American history. I cannot say that Attleboro was squarely in the progressive column, not when the Republican candidate William Howard Taft outpolled progressive Teddy Roosevelt in the 1912 presidential election here. And even on the city charter question, the proposal favored by the local progressive leader did not carry. He was Walter Briggs. Some of you may remember him as Judge Briggs, the marrying judge who officiated at many a ceremony held at the Rose Garden in Capron Park across the street from his home on County Street. I got to meet him through microfilmed 1914 editions of the Attleboro Sun as an idealistic young attorney. His plan to govern Attleboro with a 5-member city council and an appointed city manager did not resonate with the lawmakers on Beacon Hill. But the progressive movement in the nation was surely conducive to the cityhood movement in Attleboro. The prevailing mindset was that problems could be solved and that we have a duty to come up with solutions. Attleboro followed that lead with its decision to replace a balky town government with a more streamlined city one. So how do you relate my 1960s against their 19-teens on the question of the most exciting time to live in? Vietnam War of the 60s versus World War I of the teens? How would you score it? The sex, drugs, and rock and roll counterculture of the 60s versus the opposite trend toward complete prohibition with the temperance movement of the teens? How would you score that? The feminist movement of the 60s versus the suffrage movement of the teens. The war on poverty of the 60s versus the various efforts of the 19-teens to reduce human suffering. The civil rights movement of the 60s versus, for me, that's the tiebreaker. You don't see any reference to civil rights in 1914 editions of the Attleboro Sun. There's no call to examine racial prejudice. What you do find are occasional reports of lynchings in the South, or of a Negro, that was the polite term of the time, being shot to death in California over a questionable comment to a white woman. For me, that's the tiebreaker. I'll take the 60s. But I'll also admit that at least a couple of examples that I've given point up the fact that this division of the past into years and decades is mostly an abstraction It's a convenience that makes manageable a study of history that would otherwise be too dizzying. That suffrage movement of the teens made possible the feminist movement of the 60s. Those lynching headlines of the teens bore witness to the abominable conditions that, too slowly to be sure, led to the civil rights movement of the 60s. History is all of one piece. But that sets us free, I think, to declare that whichever decade we came of age in was the most exciting time to live in ever. But I do hope that we can all leave here tonight feeling at least some little bit of the energy that prevailed in the neighborhood around us in 1914, the charter year for Attleboro. Thank you. If you got any questions, yeah.
I have a question. You wrote, I believe, in one of your columns that a woman in Attleboro wanted to run for mayor before women had the vote. Do you recall writing
Well,
that?
I don't think that was quite it. Her name was Eliza Daggett. I think she ran after 1920. Oh, yeah, she ran in the election in which Sweeney was elected mayor of Attleboro. Sweeney would drive her. She lived in the building that he owned, the Atherton's building, and he would drive her to the campaign rallies. They got along great. She married into the Attleboro Daggett family. Her other claim to fame is that, and I can't remember this as sharply as I want, is that she was also the first woman to serve as a scorer for a professional baseball team. She was originally from the Midwest, and that may have been after she left Attleboro, but she was the official scorer, but she didn't sit in the dugout, as I remember. She'd be up in the stands.
You mentioned feminists, and so I thought
Yeah.
you remember about her.
Yeah, Eliza Daggett. Anything else? Yeah,
There used to
Ray.
be a plaque behind that building next to the railroad track talking about how many hundreds were inducted into the Civil War from Attleboro.
Yeah.
Do you remember that plaque? Somebody just took that and thought it'd be a good antique. But it was, well, right where the Chronicle is.
Yeah, I think it was Union Hall. That's upstairs over the old.
Right. Can you comment at all on what happened to the boys from Attleboro who gathered there and I guess got on the railroad trains going to?
No, I can't read. I haven't looked at that at all. It'd be complicated. But 1860s, I think the main rallying place for Attleboro troops for the Civil War, I think was Baptist Common in North Attleboro. So they were one Attleboro and North Attleboro are one community up until 1887, I think it was.
They actually left there. Right?
Yeah, they might have taken the train down here, but you know,
Yeah. Yeah, I
I just don't know about
how
that
they
one.
fared.
Anything else? If not, if you could humor me for a personal epilogue. I spent most of the last year in 1914 Attleboro, so it seemed. I even spent spent a couple of months in southeastern Kentucky, but still felt like I was in 1914 Attleboro. But more recently, I got involved with a project that took me into the 1960s. I've been working with Paul Pickering. I know a couple of you know him, maybe many of you don't. He was severely injured 28 years ago in an accident, left him a quadriplegic. And I've been helping him organize his memoirs. And just finished work on it just over the weekend, The Privileged Life of Paul Pickering. Part 1, Growing Up in Attleboro, 1955 to 1971. It was fun to get back into at least the 20th century. I think I may arrive in the 21st any week now. But Paul's story, tells the story of his teen years when he set out to prove that he was anything but a mama's boy. So there's some tales of pranks and kind of a modern story of a bad boy. But it has some very life-affirming elements to it. Despite his handicap, he's a very positive guy. And it also has, I think, some nice verbal snapshots of Attleboro in the 60s and 70s. If anybody's interested, they're available. But anyway, well, thanks again for having me. Yes, sir.